And as I've gotten to know your story over the past 7 years, I've been very inspired by all the work you've done, both currently with IDRA, a San Antonio-based nonprofit that partners with local school districts down here in the Valley, researches a lot of important issues related to school finance and school accountability in Texas, and your work working directly with families, getting on the ground out in the field and actually making a difference when it comes to helping people improve their lives down here. And I deeply admire that about you. Plus, what we're going to be talking about today is your long history of Chicano movement activism and education since the 60s. So I welcome you, Aurelio. Thank you so much for stopping by.
I feel honored by the invitation and glad to be there, because we are not only just colleagues in your work, but we are co-authors of books. Some have already been published and some soon to be.
That's right. It's something I should let everyone know. Everything we're about to talk about is going to be in book form in a matter of a year, maybe a year and a half, through A&M TAMU Press. Currently, tentative title might change. The course, The Education of Aurelio Manuel Montemayor, co-authored with Aurelio, helping him tell his story on the page in a historical memoir that I hope you all can hold one day in your hands very soon. Just a couple of weeks ago, we got confirmation from TAMU Press that the project has been approved, and I'm very grateful to have worked on that project together with Aurelio, and really admire all your work. Getting to write and revise this work was one thing. I hope now talking about it, many more people can understand the significance of your work and your history. So let's jump into it.
Sure.
Aurelio, can you tell us a little more about your current work with IDRA to set the stage?
Well, I've been with the Intercultural Development Research Association since September of '75. That was probably when your grandparents were born, Thomas, but it's been a good while. And I've conducted training, done curriculum development, and many other jobs. When I came to IDRA, I already had been a classroom teacher, a VISTA trainer, supervisor, a lead trainer in a nonprofit organization that I had helped co-found. So I came with about 10 years of intense experience, and also having become a very active member of the Chicano movement. So when I came to IDRA, it was the perfect blend of two things: the advocacy, the activism, the wanting excellent schools for all our kids, and also working with teachers, education, getting back into the education stream and helping develop curriculum, things like that. Soon after I joined IDRA, because of my experience as a community organizer, I became the lead, the point person for family engagement. And the current way we call it is Education Cafe. Our focus in family engagement has to do with family leadership in education, not so much, the PTA kind of involvement or doing parenting workshops to help the parents become better parents, but looking on how the voice of those parents, especially, for example, in the Valley, those families from the colonias, that they have an equal position with the school and be listened to, because their dreams and desires are just as great as any other family around. So we've done a lot of work in the Valley. I've been connected to the Valley for a long time, and later on we're going to talk about some early projects. But currently, for example, we have a very dynamic relationship with a grassroots organization called Arise Adelante, and we've been connected with them since 1998, and with the Far San Juan Alamo School District. We helped establish means of communication for organizations across the Valley who are focusing on education. And with Arise's work, for example, we started what we call mini mesas, where we had students from PSJ speak to the parents about the benefits of the dual language program, where you have students graduating from high school with the seal of biliteracy on their diploma, which means they're fully biliterate in both languages. Students graduating with college credit hours, some with even Associate of Arts. And a lot of the grassroots families don't know the details of that. But we didn't want an educator to do it. We wanted the students themselves to speak to the parents about the benefits. The ones that had dropped out and came back to prepare to go to college. The parents speaking about the workshops and the benefits they've been receiving from the district. And so our focus is that the voice of the student, the voice of the family, be there, be up front. And we've had a lot of success. We're really happy with the work. During that work, in fact, you and one of your colleagues, Isaac Bailon, presented at the very first of those mini mesas. We were at that middle school, Escalante, in Las Milpas. And that's one of the early presentations I heard you make about CSLAP. We already knew you and I knew what you were doing. And so you became part of what the community knew was a service out there. We held up. The reason why we haven't done any more mini mesas is because of the pandemic. When the face-to-face meetings stopped, a lot of things stopped. But because CSLAP was there, and CSLAP and IDRA have collaborated on several things, certainly with Arise. You've had sessions on the FAFSA, the TAFSA, how to apply for college. You've told them about the essay writing and things like that. So I see a great value in our relationships. You as young people giving back to the Valley, coming back, and especially focusing on something that's so important and that so many families want. They want their children prepared for college, graduated from high school, and being accepted in college. And that's a very key and important thing. Most schools have not solved that. I mean, it's already in place maybe for the top 10%, but for the most families and for poor families in colonias who don't speak English, who have very little experience of our school systems, what CSLAP is doing is, we see at IDRA is very important, a piece of that equity, of that excellence that's needed by the students. So we will continue to have projects together with PSJ, with CSLAP, with Arise. And I see this as a continuation of the Chicano movement. We might not have the strong language of the movement, but our goals when we marched 50 years ago was we wanted not only our history and culture be included in the teaching, but that our students be college material. Because when I marched 50 years ago and left the classroom, I was seeing my students going as cannon fodder to Vietnam, coming back in a coffin, and then there were heroes. And a lot of their colleagues were not seen as college material. We still have that dilemma. We still have, I think, if you go to most school districts in the Valley, you see the middle of the road students as not being given the support and services that we've always wanted, because they are college material if they're only taught right and guided in the right way.
I love that you give all this context, Aurelio, both historical and personal, and often those two fuse in such, I think, blending ways that are kind of seamless. I was talking about the fall riot earlier and the Edcal Shelsa high school walkouts of '68, and how here in the Valley, we often think about historical events like what happened with Cesar Chavez and the farm worker movement as kind of distant, both in time and place. But it happened in our backyard, and we might very well know people who actually protested, who were actually a result and a victim of a lot of prejudice and discrimination. And in your case, someone who actually stood up and fought for all of this over time. So I'd like to take us back in time a little bit to your beginnings as an educator. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you became a teacher and how eventually you branched out from teaching into Chicano movement activism?
Well, I don't think it could have, if people had known me when I was growing up in Laredo. I grew up on the border. You know, my dad grew up in Cerrado, Nuevo León. He came when he was a young man, married my mother. On my mother's side, we were supposedly, to her history, connected to one of the land grant families in Laredo. So it's an ancient connection, you know, back to the 1700s. But I grew up very proud of the dual culture. We spoke both languages at home. My parents were very literate. They read a lot in Spanish and in English. So early on, I liked reading. And because I was not allowed to play with my neighbors, when I was 3 years old, I had a brother who was killed in a car accident. He was an Aggie. He was in the second year. He was a sophomore in college. And as a result of that, I was overprotected. I was, you know, in the barrio where I grew up in Laredo, I could not hang out with the other kids, play with them. But I early on, I was an altar boy at Guadalupe Church. I went to a Catholic school, St. Joseph's, from third grade to 12th grade. And my mother worked, her last profession was she was the registrar at a junior high school. So she had a lot of close friends that were teachers. And by observing them as teachers, especially the speech and drama teacher that was very close to us, Lauro Canales, and some of the other teachers, I was absorbing a little bit about good teaching without knowing it, and not even knowing that I was going to become a teacher. But then when I went to college, I went to St. Louis University in Austin, graduated in '64. And while I was there, I attended a religious retreat called El Cursillo de Cristiandad. And when I came back to Laredo that summer, I helped with the cursillos in Laredo, and I met some people from Del Rio, some who were school administrators in San Felipe Independent School District, a school district that was a separate district within Del Rio. And so it was a summer of before my junior year in college, and they wanted me, even without a degree, go teach. And I said, no, let me get my degree. But by the time I graduated in '64, I already had a signed contract. So I became a teacher. And it was easy. It was convenient in the sense that I did not have to go out and look for a job. But in my mind, I wanted to become a writer. But when I went to Del Rio as a complete new person, I fell in love with the community and with the act of teaching. So what I had learned about being a good teacher was more, for example, how the speech and drama teacher that was a close friend of the family spent so much time dedicated to helping the students to act in plays, to give speeches, to compete. And I thought that that was something very good. I later realized when I started teaching that I did some of that myself. The teachers that my mother befriended became my mentors. And so I learned about good teaching by observing them, although I didn't know it was preparing me to be a teacher. My barrio was a working class environment. Most men in the families in my neighborhood were doing hard labor. Even some of the families went up north to the Piscas each year. Even though I was a little bit of an outsider in my neighborhood because I was overprotected, I was also different because I was a bookworm, and that stood out in my neighborhood. But I think that what that did, it prepared me in terms of a teacher of literature, of English, because I read so much and I liked reading. I mean, it just came to me naturally. My escapes were like in the summer going next door to I was given permission to go play at the front porch of Chole, the next door neighbor, and we would play loteria with beans marking to mark the tables. Don Everardo, her husband, would call out the cards, usually with a little couplet that went with each card. I don't remember any of them, but those were I grew up in a Mexican/Chicano environment, but also had this dual existence because of my connection to reading plays and poetry and things like that.
That's where I think our stories are so intertwined and parallel. When I first learned about all this, I was an English major at Princeton, and your love of literature and wanting to be a writer and how that translated to the classroom really resonated with me. I just talked about the issue of diversity and how writing about it in the college application process is mattering more and more nowadays. And so everything you just talked about from a practical perspective of how do we get students engaged in their education from coming at a point of understanding where they're at, not just teaching them what's in the textbook, but being more culturally sound and aware in the classroom. And what fascinates me about your story is how it didn't just stop in the classroom, how beyond the walls of the classroom, you still practiced a lot of these pedagogical skills and ways of impacting your community. Can you tell me a little more about that moment that you started transitioning from just high school teacher into Chicano Movement activist?
Yeah, the last year that I taught in the classroom was 1967-68. I was a very popular, much loved teacher in that small community. Del Rio was a racially divided community, with San Felipe being the Mexican barrio, and the other part of town was where the Anglos lived. And there were a few Mexican families living out there, but I was in what was considered solidly the Mexican neighborhood that had, in fact, developed its own school district in the 30s because they got tired of having secondhand books and secondhand teachers. So that last year, I somehow was becoming, the summer before my last year of teaching, I had taken a course at UT Austin with Americo Paredes called The Folklore of Greater Mexico. And it started churning a lot of stuff in my head about how connected I was to my Mexican roots as they were in Texas. Not, we had relatives in Mexico, but it was very much a Chicano thing in myself. And so when I started teaching, I started having, the literature book was American literature. That was the reader for junior English. And there was no mention of us, of our history, our culture, our literacy, anything like that. And so I started thinking about that and started trying to figure out how the students could explore that. What was their culture, how they could talk to their families about who they were, where they came from, and why that was important, and how those would be the things they would write about. When you talk about students writing essays for their college application, we were not taught that our background and our multicultural roots was somehow an asset, that this was something of value. And that became very important to me. I was a little bit of a snob in terms of literature and the arts, because I liked that a lot, but I loved my student too. And I also loved my environment and hated the fact that I picked up that there was like an inferiority complex about who we were, that somehow Spanish was a second level kind of language, that if you had a French accent or a German accent, oh, you were educated, you were a scientist. Oh, but Mexican, oh, that's somehow beneath you. And that was never something that I could accept or like, because I had grown up with such pride about this duality. And having visited the summer before I started teaching Mexico City and gone to the Museo de Antropología and the things in Mexico City that represented major milestones in the history of Mexico, it further made me aware of the richness in our roots. Not as much of what we were in Texas, because I was labeled a pocho in Mexico, but still that diversity. And how dare a monolingual English speaker somehow think that we who were bilingual were somehow inferior, it was just all that stuff. And I was helping the students rethink that and transmit that. I wasn't clear on it. I still wasn't aware of the Chicano movement, but I remember I had them write essays. What is the connection between love of my culture and patriotism and love of my country? I was having, how do we balance those things? What do they mean? Because on the one hand, we were all aware of how much our people had contributed soldiers to the wars, for the First World War, the Second World War, the Korean conflict. Vietnam was alive at that time. And we were so proud of all the, Purple Hearts and the lives lost because of our people defending this country that was giving back very little. And I was starting to become, at that time, I was very much aware of the Black movement and admired it, but hadn't seen the exact connections and parallel issues within our own community, our own culture. For one thing, I had grown up somewhat protected, so I had never seen a restaurant that did not serve you inside, and you had to go to a little window to buy your hamburgers in Hereford on your way up north. I had not experienced the racial separation until I went to Del Rio, but there it was because I was living in a separate community. I did not see the signs in the window, saying we weren't admitted and stuff like that. But as I was exploring that, I was moving unawarely towards what was already an organized movement, but I was not in touch with, I had not seen. Then through connections with the Volunteers in Service to America Vistas that were there in Del Rio that last year that I taught, they told me there was this new program. They were going to have an experimental project, a special project within Vista, where they were going to recruit the Vistas from the local population, and the supervisors, trainers were also going to come from local professionals. And so I was selected the summer of 1968, and that was when I met leaders of the Chicano movement in Texas, and I became totally committed to activism.
And to give our young viewers some context, Aurelio, who might not know what Vista is, can you give a little background of that program?
Right. When Kennedy became president, he has this vision of programs, and the first major program that was started under that vision was the Peace Corps, where pretty much middle-class white kids from college went to other countries to help, somehow to be of service. And it was a very attractive thing for students that were looking for a way to serve. And it was not thought through very well, because most of them went with very limited notions about what the world was like. And they were like knights in shining armor going to save the world. And in fact, had very little of what those countries and cultures needed in terms of assistance, and had very patronizing views. Well, another program was being thought up, and it didn't really come to blossom until after the assassination. But his brother-in-law, who stayed in the government, Shriver, actually developed this, they called it the Domestic Peace Corps. So they would recruit students from colleges to work like in barrios in South Texas, and go to small towns in the South and work with poor families of color. But again, they were usually, nice people, but didn't have as much to offer as they thought they did. Somehow they figured their presence would somehow be a great support. Well, families needed jobs and education and other things, and they couldn't do much of that, but they were not bad people. I liked them because they connected somewhat to the larger kind of culture that I was interested in, that I'd gotten interested in college. So I became close friends with them. And through them, then I connected to this very special but different kind of form of VISTA, which was a pilot project. It only lasted a year.
That was the Minority Mobilization Project.
Yeah, the VISTA Minority Mobilization Project, yes. And the government division was called the Office of Economic Opportunity as part of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And our supervisor in Austin for this program was a young man, Gonzalo Barrientos, who eventually became a state senator. Actually, he's retired now. And so through that program, it was in Del Rio, in San Antonio, in Laredo, in the Valley, and El Paso. These became connection places, not way beyond what the VISTA program was supposed to be. It became connection for the larger Chicano movement, where that's when walkouts were happening and protests were happening all over the state. And a lot of high school students were organizing around what they didn't like in the schools, the racism in school, the lack of support, and all those other issues. And so the first Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization was the strongest activist group at that time. And they were kind of a radical move from the traditional organizations like LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, or the GI Forum, who were civil rights organizations for the Mexican American, but were a little bit more polite,
Yeah, earlier I was talking about the far right on stream, and I searched up on Handbook of Texas far right, and Mayo came out, Mexican American Youth Organization, just speaking to how a lot of these young organizers all across the country were part of Mayo at some point, or there might have been regional organizers or state organizers in Texas. And your work with both VISTA and Mayo really fascinates me because it shows this progression deeper, if you will, into the Chicano movement, working first with VISTA and the Minority Mobilization Project in this kind of domestic Peace Corps, working alongside people from different backgrounds, and then much more so jumping into Mayo, Mexican American Youth Organization, working directly with people on the ground. And can you tell us a little more about your Mayo work and how that differed from the previous work you were doing?
Well, when I went back to Del Rio, it was clear I was going to be the supervisor trainer for 20 Vistas. But I also went back determined that we were going to organize a Mayo group. So I brought a group of my students together. Some were just gotten out of high school, some were still in high school, and talked to them about the Chicano movement in Mayo. And we got a group of about 15 to 20 immediately to form a Mayo group. I was their mentor. They started trying to organize in the barrios, trying to raise consciousness about the bigger issues, the racism, how our institutions were controlled and not serving our people the way they should, not just schools, but health and everything else. And very aware of that there was a white control of the political scene, that even though we might have control in some smaller communities because the numbers were there, the power structure was white and very damaging to the future of our community. And so the Mayo efforts were very strong, shocked a lot of the community. A lot of the older Mexican-American families didn't like the word Chicano. They didn't like this confrontation, this marching. And yet it started waking up people everywhere. 6 months into my project, the local board stopped it because of the Mayo organizing. They fired me. There was a public trial, and I was caught totally off guard. I had never been involved in something like this. I didn't know that for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so I was shocked, but did not, how should I put it? Did not apologize or think that I had done the wrong thing. It was just that we weren't effective enough soon enough. And the larger Mayo network, I think, was caught off guard with that huge march. It was in Palm Sunday of 1969. And thousands of people went to El Rio to march. The news media was all over the place. And so I was catapulted not just into the Chicano movement, but into a very public kind of leader, without expecting that to happen.
Right.
I didn't fit very well within the Mayo leadership and structure, but that was okay. I was already committed to that movement, and things happened soon after that I left El Rio because I couldn't work there. I wouldn't have been able to get a job as a dog catcher at that point.
Yeah, and this leads to the two topics I really want to dive deep into, what I consider your primary contributions to South Texas and especially the Chicano movement at large. Earlier, I mentioned the title of our book is The Course, and that means many things. It is the course of life, your historical memoir, the course as in related to education, and also the course, a translation of the curso. And one of your main contributions to the movement, the Curso de la Raza, really, really fascinated me when you first showed me the pedagogy behind it, the concept behind it, and how you executed it. So can you tell us more about the Curso de la Raza?
Sure. When I got involved in the VISTA training, one of the people I met was Chicano Garcia. He was a San Antonio activist, an older man who had been very active he was a mail carrier, and he was very active in the mail carriers union. And when he and I met, and we both said we had been cursillistas, which was part of the Catholic movement, we realized that there was something in that event that had relevance to what we wanted to do now. So the very next training that he was involved in was at a little town close to Del Rio. We brought our new vistas to be trained there in Brackettville. That's where they filmed The Alamo too. He had recruited a couple of his buddies from the Cursillo to co-present, and he wanted to do something that was not religious, but cultural. And it didn't work, but I knew exactly what he meant. And I told him, look, let's develop a curso. Let's do it so that it has the same kind of impact that religious retreat had, where men were transformed, in very dramatic ways. But we want to focus on the liberation of the Chicano community. And so then I connected with another colleague in the Valley. When I moved to the Valley to start Jacinto Trevino, Roberto Flores, a Franciscan priest, was head of a project, a church-funded project in the Valley. He was also very, very progressive and had been a cursillista. He was a Franciscan priest at the time. And so the three of us got together and started thinking through and developing what then it became the Curso de la Raza. And it was a 2-day retreat to bring people together to give new energy to our values, our history, our assets, to look at what divided us internally, and to see how communities at the grassroots level could organize and support the organizations that already existed, what was already going on, whether it was Mayo or LULAC or whatever, but that we saw the need for a lot of new leadership and also community connection. So we had about a 7-year period of developing these cursos and conducting them in the Valley and close to Corpus Christi and San Antonio, mostly in South Texas, and inviting families, working class families and young people and abuelitos. And it was a very valuable experience. You and I have written about it, and we'll have a book on it, I hope, soon. But it was a unique thing, and if I hadn't written about it, it would have been lost to history, and I thought it was just an important event. The other thing that I was part of then was the starting of an independent Chicano college. The summer of '69, the December of '69, at La Lomita, what had been an oblate seminary where they trained priests right south of Mission. It was a large structure that the church had built many years ago for as a seminary for training of priests. It was rented out to the Head Start program, and that because Head Start was closed during the winter holidays, Mayo was allowed to have its first statewide conference, and I attended. I brought some Mayos from Del Rio there. And while I was there talking with somebody else at night, we said, we need something like the HBCUs. We knew that the Black colleges had been a very important resource and community place for the Black community. We wanted something similar. So I went back to Del Rio, packed my duds, and then took the bus and went to the Valley. I lived in Weslaco, and we started it in Mercedes. The first group, some are still there in the Valley. Adolfo Duffy Ramirez had been a teacher. We had Alma Canales, Andre Guerrero from Laredo, myself, Carmen Lomas Garza, who's now famous. She was from Kingsville, and she was become a very famous painter and lives in California. Franco Alejandro, Lupe Saavedra, Juan and Marta Cotera. Marta Cotera has been a very important Chicana feminist in the movement. Narciso Aleman, his wife, Nita Gonzalez Aleman, who was Corky Gonzalez's daughter. Rubén Solís, Aminieto. These were the people that started it. Francisco Briones, Silvia Llanes. So this was a core group. After about a year and a half, though, we had serious problems. We split, and half of us left. From the ones that left, Dr. Leonard Mensas and Andre Guerrero started a comparable college that ended up in Austin called Juarez Lincoln. Those of us who had left got our master's through that extension of Antioch College, and our master's work had been to start an independent Chicano college with an undergraduate degree. That's been written about. There's been probably more that could be written. I've been trying to get together the people that were my side that left to kind of put our document together. We haven't done that yet. I'm hoping that happens. But those are two events, the Curso de la Raza and then Colegio Jacinto Trevino.
Yeah, in your description, the Colegio resonates with me because both the Curso, which is this independent 3-day weekend retreat on the outside of all these systems, outside the classroom, plus the Colegio, you creating your own institution to bring students in to educate them in very particular ways. This is outside the traditional high school classroom, and you're able to take education and pedagogy and really combine it with issues of let's learn more about our identity. Let's go change our barrios. Let's go change our communities. Education becomes practical. Can you tell us a little more about the Colegio curriculum, what kind of stuff students were learning in that period?
Well, we were trying to collect what there was written by Chicanos. And in fact, our plan was eventually to have a clearinghouse of publications. We were trying to learn and extend what Américo Paredes had wanted of each of us going out and actually documenting the stories of the old people before they died, the culture, the history, what had been happening, all the stuff that had been left out of our history books, but also learning what is it that really liberates you? What is it that we want? Is it just that economics, having more money, having a better job? What are the values that we want to protect and grow? What is our connection to the ancient cultures that we knew so little about, the Nahuas, the Mayas, and all that other stuff? And also, some of us were influenced and thought a lot about the stuff that Paulo Freire was writing about, the pedagogy of the oppressed. How is education actually a force of liberation? In other words, we were exploring that. We were exploring what it would take to be both an educated Chicano with a degree, but with deep commitment to help your own community, to fix the institutions that weren't working, to support the worker. You know, we were so aware of the thousands of families that would go from the valley up north each year to pick crops, hard work, badly paid, and yet such an important service to the nations that put fruit and vegetables on the table and things like that. How do you document and collect that history and give it the value that, quote, the educated people would get, or that the leaders would get? In other words, the value of work, the dignity of it, and how does that come out in art, in poetry? How is it documented? We were exploring a lot of that. Some people had strong focus on workers' rights, the class struggle, and things like that. We had made connections with some youth groups in Mexico City who were trying to keep the memory alive and protest the massacre in the Plaza de Tlatelolco in 1968. There had been horrible political attacks on students and those that were trying to reform Mexican culture, and then the run of the country by the rich and the oppression of the poor and the worker, you know, and so we had a lot in common. We visited them, they visited us. So we had also plans in terms of the art, certainly with Carmen Lomas Garza there, in terms of what was our new art going to look like, what would it be, how could we express our uniqueness, that we were somewhat Mexican and somewhat Texan, but we're something else, you know, and stuff like that. And our conversations were about those things. We didn't stick it out long enough to come out with the products we wanted or the classes we wanted, but it certainly were, the conversations were very interesting.
I can imagine, because all this critical consciousness work really takes not just individual journeys like your own, going from high school teacher to Vista to Mayo to all these great initiatives, but also a controlled environment where you can critically analyze yourself and your environment. And that is what I see is really special about the Curso and the Colegio. So you granted young people, and especially young men of the time, a place to do that. And I feel like we nowadays can learn a lot from that. What is the classroom? What is a Zoom room? What is education in general, but an environment in which people can come together in a controlled space and uplift one another? The mechanisms through which we do that are different. That's pedagogy. But if our goal is the same, then at least we can get there in some way, shape, or form. And I really enjoyed learning about your story and how it not only was personal, but it impacted others in that collective way. And now us learning about it through the book that will be coming out, through TAMU Press, and through this Zoom talk, and through every time you tell your story, Aurelio, it really demonstrates the power of storytelling and the power of living history, not just sharing our stories, but other people can absorb them and then take that info and do something with it in the real world. So I deeply appreciate you sharing it.
Well, I really value your honoring me in this way. I certainly value what you and your colleagues are doing as young adults and professionals. The valley, like Laredo and border towns, always suffer from brain drain, and you were showing how to give back and how important it is to give back in your own communities. I think that's very, very valuable and inspiring.
Thank you. That means a lot, Aurelio. And through your advising, it has helped us do even more good work. So since knowing each other since 2014, you've helped CSLAP grow and develop into what it is today too. So living history, living action through CSLAP. So is there anything else you'd like to share, Aurelio, before you move on to your next activity? I know
we're planning our Saturday. There's a big statewide summit on the Mexican American Studies Network, and we're going to have a planning meeting in a few minutes. No, I think this has been good. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you for flashing your CSLAP mug and connecting this history. I think it's not just history, but it's a living history. So thank you, Aurelio, for proving that and demonstrating that.
Thank
And
you.
thank you for your time and attention. So thank
Bye-bye.
you, Aurelio. I'll be in touch.
Okay, bye-bye.
That was Aurelio Montemayor, living history. What I really got from that talk, in addition to all the awesome facts about how all this Hispanic heritage and Chicano movement history impacts us here in the Valley and how it literally happened here in the Valley, is that we can continue taking the lessons from that period and doing work today. It's different than just watching a video, reading a book, internalizing the info, but actually learning how to get that out into the real world and impacting other people. I like to believe that CSLAP is a manifestation of that, that we can take the lessons of the past and change the present, and in the process, making a better future. We invest in our youth, they grow older, they then invest in the next generation. And it's a never-ending cycle of altruism that enables us to uplift our communities. So thank you again, Aurelio.